When the American Civil War erupted in April 1861, few on either side imagined the scale strategy began shifting westward. The goal was to seize control of the Mississippi River and divide the Confederacy. General Ulysses S. Grant, relatively unknown in 1861, had already captured Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee, earning the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. Now he set his sights deeper into the South. Grant's army gathered at Pittsburgh Landing, near a small Tennessee church called Shiloh. Waiting for reinforcements under General Don Carlos Buell, Grant underestimated the threat from Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston, who was massing troops in Corinth, Mississippi. The Confederate surprise attack. On April 6th, the Confederates launched a surprise dawn assault. Union camps were caught off guard. Many soldiers were bayoneted in their tents. Confederate forces pushed the Union Army back toward the Tennessee River in chaotic fighting. The battle was confused, brutal, and marked by dense woods, smoke, and screams. By midday, Confederate momentum slowed. Fierce resistance formed at a location known as the Hornet's Nest, where Union troops under Generals Prentiss and Wallace held out for hours before surrendering. Tragically, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston was mortally wounded during the fighting. His loss would deprive the South of one of its best field commanders. Day 2. Union counterattack. Overnight, Buell's reinforcements arrived. On April 7th, the Union launched a fierce counterattack. With fresh troops and artillery support, Grant drove the Confederates back across the battlefield and reclaimed lost ground. By afternoon, the battered Confederate army retreated to Corinth. Shiloh became the bloodiest battle in American history to that point. Over 23,000 casualties in 2 days. Impact. The shock of Shiloh changed perceptions. No longer could either side cling to illusions of a quick war. The human cost was staggering. Grant faced heavy criticism for being unprepared, but Lincoln refused to remove him, saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Strategically, the Union began consolidating its hold on western Tennessee and setting the stage for future campaigns along the Mississippi. The Peninsula Campaign and 7 days battles, March to July 1862, McClellan's grand plan. Meanwhile, in the East, General George B. McClellan led the Army of the Potomac in a bold plan to capture Richmond by landing on the Virginia Peninsula between the York and James Rivers. McClellan, cautious and methodical, was loved by his troops, but distrusted by Lincoln for his political arrogance and slowness to act. Landing at Fort Monroe in March 1862, McClellan advanced slowly toward Richmond. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston opposed him initially, but withdrew toward the capital. The siege of Yorktown and the road to Richmond. Instead of launching a direct assault on Yorktown, McClellan chose to lay siege, delaying the campaign for weeks. This allowed the Confederates to reinforce Richmond. lines, while Lee's forces dwindled. Sherman's Atlanta Campaign, May to September 1864. Sherman's advance. In the Western Theater, General William T. Sherman launched an offensive to capture Atlanta, a vital Confederate transportation and industrial hub. Opposing him was General Joseph E. Johnston, who employed delaying tactics, retreating steadily while avoiding major confrontations. Sherman, frustrated by this Fabian strategy, engaged in continuous flanking maneuvers. Leadership change. We are here to end it. Savannah Falls. On December 21st, 1864, Sherman telegraphed Lincoln, "I beg to present you, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah." The 1864 election, Lincoln's crucial victory. By summer 1864, the war seemed endless. Casualties mounted. Northern morale sagged. Lincoln's re-election was in jeopardy. But the fall of Atlanta and Sherman's march revived hope. Lincoln defeated Democrat George B. McClellan, a former general who ran on a peace platform. Lincoln's re-election ensured that the war would continue until unconditional Confederate surrender, and that emancipation would remain central to Union war aims. Summary of 1864. 1864 was a year of unrelenting pressure and massive destruction. vary, but over 620,000 soldiers died, possibly 750,000, including disease and accidents. Millions were wounded. Families were destroyed. The South lay in ruins. Cities burned, railroads twisted, plantations destroyed, and its economy devastated. Slavery was abolished, but the struggle for racial justice had only begun. Legacy of the war's final year. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment. The federal government emerged stronger, more centralized. The Southern social order, based on slavery and white supremacy, was shattered, though resistance to equality would persist for generations. 1865 was not just an end, but a beginning. The United States entered a new era, facing Reconstruction, racial turmoil, and the challenge of healing a broken nation. Conclusion: a nation reborn in fire. The final year of the Civil War was a relentless march toward total Union victory and Confederate defeat. Grant's unyielding campaign against Lee, Sherman's trail of destruction through the Deep South, and Lincoln's re-election and assassination all symbolized the immense transformation the country was undergoing. Though the Union was preserved, it was forever changed. The war had tested the nation's ideals, shattered its illusions, and paved the way for a new birth of freedom. The blood and fire of 1865 forged a different America, one poised to grapple with the promises of liberty, justice, and unity for all. Political leadership and decisions. Abraham Lincoln's presidency, steering a fractured nation. When Abraham Lincoln assumed the presidency in March 1861, he inherited a nation on the brink of disintegration. 7 southern states had already seceded, and more would follow after the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Lincoln's inaugural address was a careful balance, firm in Union preservation, conciliatory toward the South, and silent on immediate abolition. Yet, within months, he would find himself leading the nation through its greatest internal crisis. Lincoln's presidency was defined by a steady moral resolve, political pragmatism, and a capacity to evolve. Though a relatively inexperienced national politician, his leadership style emphasized clarity of purpose, moral vision, and political adaptability. As Commander-in-Chief, Lincoln oversaw vast military and political transformations, but always tethered his decisions to the goal of preserving the Union. Leadership style. Lincoln held an open door asserting his duty to act decisively in defense of the Union. Balancing security and liberty, Lincoln later sought and received congressional authorization for the suspension in 1863. Still, his actions sparked fierce debate. Lincoln himself acknowledged the dilemma, famously asking, "Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted, and the government itself go to pieces lest that one be violated?" In retrospect, while controversial, the suspension reflected the gravity of the crisis and Lincoln's commitment to preserving constitutional government, even at the cost of temporarily bending its norms. Role of Congress and the Confederate government. Union Congress. The U.S. Congress, under Republican control for much of the war, played a critical role in wartime governance. Passed the Homestead Act, 1862, to promote Western settlement. Chartered the Transcontinental Railroad and created a national banking system. Imposed income taxes and issued greenbacks to finance the war, supported Lincoln's emancipation measures, and authorized the 13th Amendment, ratified after the war. Despite internal divisions, particularly among war Democrats and peace Democrats, Copperheads, Congress largely cooperated with Lincoln's agenda. Radical 1863, Southern railroads were collapsing under strain, contributing to logistical paralysis. The telegraph, instant command. The telegraph, invented just 2 decades earlier, revolutionized Civil War communications. President Lincoln regularly visited the War Department Telegraph Office to receive updates and issue commands. The U.S. Military Telegraph Corps, under Andrew Carnegie and Thomas Eckert, laid thousands of miles of wire across the Union front. Advantages included real-time battlefield updates, coordination between distant units, rapid strategic decision-making. The Confederacy had some industries and farms. Still, most northern civilians were insulated from the physical destruction experienced by their southern counterparts. In the South, the war came home in a literal sense. Battles raged across Confederate territory, and Union invasions brought devastation to towns, railroads, and plantations. Southern civilians endured shortages of food, clothing, medicine, and fuel due to the Union naval blockade and the South's limited industrial capacity. Prices skyrocketed, and Confederate currency collapsed in value. Daily life was marked by anxiety, deprivation, and displacement. Women and children bore the brunt of hardship, often fleeing advancing armies or watching their homes burned in horror. Campaigns like Sherman's March, Southern morale fluctuated with battlefield victories and defeats, and as the war dragged on, desertions increased and public support for the Confederate government eroded. Role of women and children. The Civil War marked a turning point in the role of women and children who stepped into responsibilities vacated by men at war. Their contributions were critical to both the Union and Confederate home fronts, and in many ways, the war accelerated broader social changes, especially in the realm of gender roles. In the North, women took on jobs in factories, especially in textile and munitions production. Others became nurses, teachers, and fundraisers. Women's Aid Society 1965 and inadequate supplies led to severe suffering among Confederate prisoners. Out of the 12,000 men held there, nearly 3,000 died, mostly from pneumonia, malnutrition, and disease. A breakdown of prisoner exchanges in 1863 worsened the problem. Initially, both sides participated in a formal exchange system, but after the Confederacy refused to treat black Union soldiers equally, the Union halted the system. As a result, prison populations swelled and humanitarian conditions deteriorated. Both North and South used prison camps as tools of war, whether intentionally or by neglect, and their legacy stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of civil conflict. Conclusion. While generals plotted strategy and soldiers clashed in epic battles, the American Civil War reshaped the lives of civilians, women, children, enslaved people, and prisoners. The war's impact extended far beyond the battlefield, permeating homes, towns, plantations, and even childhood. The total war experience forced Americans to adapt, suffer, and persevere. Women emerged as leaders and laborers. Children bore witness to violence and instability. African Americans transformed the war into a struggle for liberation, taking bold steps toward emancipation. peace. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, lacked Lincoln's moral authority and political skill. While Lincoln had favored a moderate, reconciliatory approach to bringing the Southern states back into the Union, Johnson's policies would ultimately lead to a turbulent and ineffective period of Reconstruction. The tragedy of Lincoln's assassination was not only the loss of a national hero, but also the derailment of what might have been a more unified and just rebuilding of the nation. The surrender at Appomattox. The effective end of the Civil War came on April 9, 1865, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The surrender followed a grueling campaign in which Lee's forces, short on supplies and surrounded, had been pushed to the brink of collapse. Although other Confederate armies remained in the field, Lee's surrender symbolized the fall of the Confederacy. The meeting between Grant and Lee was conducted with dignity and mutual respect. Grant, understanding the need for reconciliation, offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would be paroled and allowed to return home with their personal possessions and horses. These lenient conditions helped pave the way for a smoother transition to peace and underscored the Union's goal of healing the nation rather than exacting revenge. In the weeks that followed, other Confederate forces surrendered. General Joseph E. Johnston surrendered to General Sherman in North Carolina, and by June, most organized Confederate resistance had ended. President Jefferson Davis was captured in May, and the Confederate government ceased to exist. The war, which had claimed over 600,000 lives and devastated much of the South, was finally over. The cost of the war: death, economy, rebuilding. A. Human cost. The American Civil War remains the deadliest conflict in U.S. history. Estimates of the total death toll range from 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers, with untold numbers of civilians also perishing from disease, starvation, and wartime violence. The toll was especially heavy in the South, where many towns lost nearly all their able-bodied men, and entire communities were decimated. Beyond deaths, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were wounded, many suffering amputations and lifelong disabilities. The psychological toll, what we might now call PTSD, was immense, but poorly understood at the time. Families were torn apart, and the social fabric of the country, particularly in the South, was left in tatters. Economic consequences. The Southern economy, heavily dependent on slave labor and agriculture, was left in ruins. Plantations were destroyed, railroads dismantled, and cities such as Richmond and Atlanta reduced to rubble. The emancipation of nearly 4 million enslaved African Americans obliterated the core of Southern economic productivity, forcing landowners and former slaves to grapple with a new system of labor. The Northern economy, by contrast, emerged stronger and more industrialized. Wartime demands had accelerated manufacturing and infrastructure development, giving the Union a significant advantage during and after the war. Nevertheless, the federal government was left with an enormous national debt, more than $2.5 billion, that would take decades to reduce. Rebuilding the nation. Reconstruction would be the monumental task of reintegrating the Southern states, rebuilding their economies, and protecting the rights of newly freed African Americans. The process was fraught with conflict, resentment, and violence. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged to resist change, while Southern legislatures enacted black codes to control the movement and labor of freed people. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, attempted to ease the transition by providing food, shelter, education, and legal aid to formerly enslaved people. However, its efforts were underfunded and resisted by local Southern leaders. Reconstruction would see moments of progress, such as the election of African Americans to local and national office, but it was also undermined by systemic racism and political compromise. By the late 1870s, with the withdrawal of federal troops from the South under the Compromise of 1877, many of the gains made during Reconstruction were reversed, setting the stage for nearly a century of Jim Crow segregation. Legacy of the 13th Amendment. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Civil War was the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which formally abolished slavery in the United States. Ratified on December 6, 1865, it stated, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." The amendment codified the principles of the Emancipation Proclamation into law and eliminated slavery as a legal institution. It was followed by the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, prohibiting denial of the vote based on race, forming the foundation of what would become the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment was a historic milestone, but its implementation faced fierce resistance. Southern states enacted laws and used violence to restrict African Americans' newfound freedom. Moreover, the loophole allowing involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime was exploited through black codes and convict leasing, laying the groundwork for systemic racial injustice in the American legal system. Nevertheless, the 13th Amendment remains a turning point in American history. It fundamentally redefined citizenship, civil rights, and national identity. It marked a moral and constitutional rebirth of the nation, aligning the United States more closely with its founding ideals of liberty and equality. Reconstruction and long-term impact. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the United States faced the monumental task of reuniting a fractured nation and addressing the rights of nearly 4 million freed African Americans. This period, known as Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, was marked by profound political struggle, social upheaval, and contested visions for the future. Presidential Reconstruction, led by President Andrew Johnson, sought a lenient approach toward the former Confederate states, allowing them to rejoin the Union with minimal conditions. However, this leniency angered many in Congress, especially radical Republicans who pushed for radical Reconstruction, a more aggressive effort to transform Southern society, guarantee civil rights, and punish the former Confederacy. Southern states quickly passed black codes, restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom and economic mobility of African Americans. In response, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and later the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons born in the U.S. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, aimed to secure voting rights for black men by prohibiting racial discrimination in voting. Despite these legal protections, white supremacist backlash was fierce. The Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist groups emerged to intimidate and violently suppress black political participation. Federal intervention helped curb the violence temporarily, but the commitment to Reconstruction weakened over time. By 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South as part of a political compromise, marking the end of Reconstruction. Southern states quickly imposed Jim Crow laws, institutionalizing racial segregation and disenfranchisement. Though Reconstruction had laid the constitutional foundation for civil rights, its premature end allowed white supremacy to dominate the South for nearly a century. The long-term impact of Reconstruction remains central to America's ongoing struggle with race, equality, and justice.